Following along with me. Somehow I left verse 21 off, but we're going to discuss it anyway. I don't know how I left verse 21 off, but anyway I did. You recall in the context that Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, Samaritan woman. He has talked to her about her relationship. It was improper, the one she is in now. And how many husbands did he say she had had in the past? 5. And so the man she's with now is not lawful for her to be with him. He has told her that. And so after that conversation, the woman had talked to Jesus, said, you know, I perceive that thou art a prophet. And of course, I think I pointed that to you. Seems like she's pretty quick to change the subject from her in condition as far as her relationships, talking about Jesus now again. But she's going to bring up this age-old controversy about Samaritans and the Jews, because she said, our fathers worship in this mountain, that is Gerizim, and ye say, that is Jews, ye say that in Jerusalem is a place where men ought to worship. And so there was that, we discussed that last time, there was that conflict that had been happening for all these years about the proper place to worship. And so he continues now, verse 21, he says, woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. That's one of the grandest truths revealed by Christ, is the hour is coming. As I said, the Jews said that men must worship at Jerusalem to do it acceptably. The Samaritans, they contended for the fact that Mount Gerizim was the proper place, the true holy place to worship God. And, you know, we have people today that insist on a pilgrimage to Mecca. The Catholic people, you got to go to the holy shrine and pray at the holy shrine. Christ says that the time, and the time even now is at hand when he's speaking, when no holy place will need to be sought for worship. And it's not going to be all that long. We're going to keep reading, and Jesus is going to talk about the fact that the temple at Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. It's going to happen pretty quickly, speaking. And so under the gospel system, no earthly location is significant. A person can worship God any location, but it has to be, we'll find out, by spirit and by the truth. And that's how the worship has to be offered. The location of worship is simply not important. We have a building. We're thankful for it. People fuss about being cold, fuss about being hot. But anyway, we have a building to worship. We're not outside in the elements. And if it's hot out there, it's cool in here. If it's cool out there, it's hot in here, whatever the situation is. But it does not matter where we locate at to worship God. We just have to worship God in spirit and in truth. And so Jesus has, she tried to bring up that age-old controversy, and Jesus says that's really insignificant, because the time is coming, it's not going to make a difference anyway. Now, you understand, at this particular time Jesus is talking, Mount Gerizim is not the proper place. It's a false worship at Mount Gerizim. But Jesus just jumps right past that point to the future when the place will not be important. He says, ye worship you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Verse 22. So the worship of the Samaritans, as I just mentioned, was a perverted, it was an unauthorized worship. God had given to the Jews the worship he had set up for the Mosaic age. It involved the tabernacle, it involved the temple. You know, it's had its altar and all the prescribed sacrifices made there. You had the laver, and the priest had to wash and go into the holy place, and then you had the candlestick and the table of showbread, the altar of incense. And then you go to the most holy place and only the high priest himself could go into the most holy place. And by the way, the high priest could only go into the most holy place how many times a year? One time a year. And what was that day called? Day of Atonement. Kenny's been talking about that on Wednesday nights. It was a Day of Atonement. The high priest, most holy place, once a year on the Day of Atonement. And the Samaritans were not allowed to take part in the Jewish arrangement. Now, you understand that as time went along, you had some individuals from different nations become what we refer to as proselytes in the Jewish religion. And when you became a proselyte in the Jewish religion, then you could involve yourself in the worship of the Jews. But even if you was a proselyte, even though you could offer worship with the Jews, you could not become a priest. So as the time went along, we talked about that last week, the people of Samaria had developed their own religion, doing their own thing. And that religion of the Samaritans was not recognized by heaven. It was unauthorized. And so its worship, therefore, was unacceptable. Now, let me tell you something, friend. These Samaritans offered their worship just as sincerely as anybody ever has. But their worship location was wrong. Their activities of worship were wrong. My friend, the same thing could be said of modern sectarians today. A person cannot go out here and develop their own worship and ordain it. You can't put your own notions into worship. You know, sometimes we think, well, we're going to do it like this, and God is obligated, if you will, to accept our offering. But that's not how it works.
The place of worship, I have never given it a great deal of thought, but you take the United States, for example. It seems like as we're reading this, there's only one place that these folks can worship. Is that not right?
Are you talking about the Samaritans?
Yes.
Yeah, they've got to go to Mount Gerizim.
The Jews.
And they're going over to Jerusalem.
One place of worship.
Yes.
And what I'm thinking is, look at America.
Yeah.
How many different places we have for worship?
This very morning. Yeah. That was a day that was coming. Location will not be important any longer.
We can find a tree limb.
Exactly right.
Anything like that. That's kind of hard for me to grasp.
Well, even when the early church was established and persecution come upon the early church, early disciples of Christ went into dark caves and worshiped God to escape persecution.
Well,
And you know
I
that.
can understand it, doing it in secret to keep from getting killed. But when it's out in the open, it seems to me like we ought to be able to go wherever we want
To worship God, we can.
wherever we can gather a group of people together.
Right. As long as it's in spirit and in truth, then our worship is acceptable. The location is irrelevant.
There, at one time, there was a great migration north for places of work. And most of the people that went from the south to the north to work, they did not find a place to worship. They had to establish their own, and most of the time they started out in the basement of the home or somewhere like that. It took them a good long while before
Then they developed as it went on, yeah.
And that hasn't been all that many years ago.
Right.
Late 1940s, 1950s, early 50s, this was the case.
Yeah.
There just wasn't that many places of worship. You had to establish one
Yes.
if you went somewhere.
Well, as Jesus is talking, the Jews go to Jerusalem. The Samaritans are on Mount Gerizim over there worshiping. And that was which one's the right place? Well, we know which one's the right place. But Jesus saying, look, the hour's coming, it's going to be irrelevant anyway. And that hour I'm talking about is happening pretty soon. It's not going to be 100 years. It's happening pretty soon. And so, notice he also says, thank you, Jim, for those comments. It said salvation of the Jews. What do you mean salvation of the Jews? Well, it was to the Jews that the inspired message was revealed. The gospel came to who first? to the Jews.
Today it comes to the Christians.
Exactly right. And so the faithful Jew was pleasing to God. The Gentile who lived by the moral precepts of the Mosaic law, that Gentile was being pleasing to God. Both had to follow God's law. During his personal ministry, and by the way, this Mosaic law is going to be done away with, but right now, Christ highly praised those certain people. He says salvation is of the Jews. But now, there are some people who were not Jews who had salvation as well because they followed the law. All right, verse 23. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. For the Lord declared that the time when this great change would occur was in the very near future. Now this is going to be after the Lord's crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection, and it's going to be specifically when the eternal kingdom was established. It was established on Pentecost Day of Acts chapter 2. Now, if you go back and look at all this again in its context, you'll see that Christ did not specifically, directly answer her question. This woman, no doubt in my mind, is still pretty stubborn about her beliefs from her childhood. You know, it had been drilled in from her childhood, no doubt, about who she was and about Mount Gerizim. And so the way he handled the situation was first to lead this woman to faith in him as the Messiah. And then when she develops her faith in him as the Messiah, then the rest of the matters fall in the right place. And friend, that is a very strong point to make. We have to first lead people to have some faith that Jesus is the Messiah. If you can get a person to accept Jesus as the Messiah and accept the authority of God's Word, then other matters will fall in their proper place. We also notice that there is such a group of people as true worshipers. Friend, if there is such a group as true worshipers, then there is of necessity another group of false worshipers. True worshipers, false worshipers. A while back in a sermon I discussed the fact about counterfeit. Virtually anything can be counterfeited. Anything that's true and meaningful can be counterfeited and probably has been counterfeited. True worship, meaningful. False worship, counterfeit of it. But the Father seeks true worship from his true servants. And true worship is only acceptable if it is offered in spirit and in truth. So true worship can only be offered by true servants of God. Verse 24, well-known verse. Did I ever show you on the screens, Ralph, Mount Gerizim? Did I pass by that yet? All right. I'm headed that way still? Oh, we'll go back to it in a minute. That is I think that was, best of my memory, that was in the 1970s when that was unearthed, Mount Gerizim. That is after archaeological digging has taken place. You can still see where Mount Gerizim, on top of the mountain where they went to worship. You see how elaborate the place was? Of course, you understand from King about the tabernacle. He didn't talk about the temple yet, but the tabernacle itself was very elaborate as well. But the temple, replaced the tabernacle. But to the north there, from Mount Gerizim, to the very top of your screen there, that's Mount Ebal, E-B-A-L. And I told you between these mountains form this natural amphitheater. And a lot of the Lord's teachings take place in that amphitheater because people could gather around and listen. You go to to a concert, you might go to an amphitheater. Why? Because of the acoustics. And so the natural location, but that is actually Mount Gerizim itself. And I think that might have been, don't hold me to it, but I think that might have been 1979 when it was excavated. 1979. But these Samaritans, they're going up there to worship. It's the wrong place. And always the wrong place, it's the wrong what? It's the wrong kind of worship. It's not true worship. I told you before last week, they took their own religion, their own man-made traditions, and they got it all rolled up into one and meshed it all together. This is our worship. Well, yeah, you're right. It's your worship. But let me tell you something, friend. It's not God's worship. This morning, the most important thing for us to do is make sure we worship the God's worship. My worship, my idea of worship don't mean nothing. God has directed me how to worship, what I'm supposed to do. And even though I can follow all the steps of worship and I can do everything just like God ordained it to be done, still don't mean I worshiped yet. We'll discuss that in just a moment. Because it's got to be in what? Got to be in spirit and in truth. So I wanted to show you. I thought I'd already passed that. But anyway, that was actually Mount Gerizim. All right, back to verse 24, Jack. Thank you. He says, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. You understand that God is a spirit being. There's nothing material, nothing physical about him. Luke 24:39, Jesus said, behold, my hands and my feet, that even as I myself handle me, and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have. Well, the apostles on that occasion, they thought that the risen Lord was a spirit. But he gave them proof that what they were seeing was a flesh and blood person. Jesus said, look here, a spirit don't have what? A spirit don't have flesh and blood and bones. A spirit has no such body, but God is a spirit. So there's no physical, no material substance about God. And sometimes the Bible talks about God's hands, his eyes, his ears, his smelling. That's a big long word called anthropomorphism. We just credit God with physical features. But friend, we can talk about the hand of God. God holds the whole world in his hand. He does, but it's not a physical hand. That's anthropomorphism. That's the kind of language they're using there. And so, those people this morning who worship idols, they are convinced they've got to have some physical image before them to offer their brand of worship to their little g God. And so they perceive some type of material image of their God. God is not anything material or physical. We don't have an image of God to worship this morning because God is indeed spirit. And so,
God gave us the hands and eyes and stuff of God because our little old minds can't understand.
That's what that language is for, to help us understand his features. And we get so upset about the Revelation letter. When you realize the situation John was writing in and what he was trying to get across, he had to use that kind of language for a reason. And he was still trying to the best of his ability and through the Spirit in that veiled language to get his point across. But when the inspiration talks to us about God, we're trying to get a picture that we can comprehend of God. That's exactly right. There's some people in their religious buildings who have great images of Mary and then also of Jesus displayed in the church building and all that stuff. And they'll somehow try to pay some homage to those figures or those pictures or whatever. But those images, those statues, whatever, those are material images. Those are physical things. And they have no life in them. They have no power to bless or curse. They can't pass along any sentiment. They can't do any work. It's just a dumb, lifeless idol. And, we have done, and this is my this is my take it like you want to this morning. If you don't have to, you don't want to, you don't have to. I personally, I'm not a big fan. I remember growing up, I used to, as a small kid in Bible class, we had pictures of the 12 apostles up on the wall. My friend, there's no doubt in my mind that the apostles didn't look anything like I had a picture in my mind all my childhood. Because there's always some American-looking individual. My friend, the apostles are not Americans. And Jesus is not an American. Jesus didn't have the same color skin as I got this morning. No doubt in my mind about that. But we try to somehow pictureize Jesus. Anyway.
I've got to tell people that the Arabian people down, that's what Jesus looked like.
Exactly right. That's what he was. That's exactly who Jesus was. Now, talking about Christ, he had no beginning. You know, you're talking about something hard for our little minds to comprehend. You know, everything we know had a beginning. The shoes you had on, the material that made the leather for your shoes had a beginning somewhere. The rubber in the soles had a beginning somewhere. You had a beginning somewhere. The pew you were sitting on had a beginning somewhere. Your spouse had a beginning. Your grandparents had, but Jesus had no beginning. In the beginning, God, that's the plural form of God, by the way. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And God had no beginning. Christ had no beginning. Always has been. And so many verses to prove that point. Jim?
That God represents all.
Exactly right. It's a plural form. It's all three of them. It's deity. God, the Holy Spirit, and the Word at that time. And there, verse 27, the same chapter, Genesis chapter 1. And then in John chapter 1, we've already discussed it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so, and Christ, by the way, is also called God. In this very book we're studying, John 20, verse 28, Thomas is going to say, my Lord and my God. So Christ possesses all the glory that pertains to deity. And thankfully that Word was made flesh to dwell among us. Since God is a spirit, those who worship him must worship him in spirit. And as I said, it's a shame for people to offer a worship to God that is a false worship. And the kind of worship that is in spirit is a worship that is from the heart. And I'm not talking about the actual physical pump. Our heart is the most innermost part of our being. We can think about the heart with four different chambers. You have the intellect, that's the mind. You have the emotions. You know we all have emotions. The third chamber be our willpower. And the fourth is our conscience. So you have intellect, you have your mind, you have emotions, you have your willpower, and you have your conscience. And all four of those chambers of the heart has got to be involved in the proper place for worship. So it must be in spirit. Has to be sincere. Has to be honest. We got to perceive what we are saying. Perceive what we are singing. Perceive what we are doing in our worship acts. Paul to the Corinthians in chapter 14, it says, what is it then? He said, I'll pray with the Spirit, and I will pray the understanding also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. And so Paul determined, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to sing in such a way that I can be profited by doing that. I'm going to use words that I can comprehend. I'm going to put my heart into what I'm doing. It's going to be sincere. When I pray, it's going to be sincere. When I give, it's going to be sincere. When I sing, when I eat the Lord's Supper, when I study the Bible, it's all in sincerity. And for our worship to be profitable, it has to be sincerely.
Anybody can come in here and pick up that songbook and sing.
Yes.
Or anybody can come in here and pick up a Bible and read it.
Yes.
But in order to worship God, the whole thing must come into focus, and we must know and understand what that's all about before we can truly worship God.
Has to be. Has to be. And as I say it, I've often say it, it is so very possible to be in the condition where I have been to church, but I ain't worshiped. I've been to church, but I ain't worshiped yet. Well, why? Well, because mine's other places. You know, have you? I'm sure Jim has. And I realize I think as I'm getting older, I've got a little more sense about me, hopefully. I've got to understand, when I get to the pulpit, I look out to a congregation of people. I've got a congregation of people primarily who all have different struggles, different things going on in their life. Now, it's my task to somehow present a lesson that I can keep everybody on the right page and focused to the best of my ability.
Your job is to get everybody in here to focus on
Right.
God and Christ and the Word. That's your job.
Now, and sometimes, Jim, if I had a switch, I'd be a little better at doing that, probably. If I could go by and just pop you on the leg, listen, like your teacher used to do. But I can't do that. But I remember one time I won't never forget this. I was asked to come and speak on a Friends Day in a congregation down in Marion County, actually, just outside of Ewan, matter of fact. Saturday night in the late afternoon hour, Saturday night, 6, 7, whatever, 8 o'clock. He was 83 years old. A man that went to the pasture to check on his cattle and stuff and had not returned home. And I didn't know anything about it till I got there Sunday morning. But almost all of the men of that congregation have been out all night. All night now they're searching for this individual. And he had finally had a little spell and sort of lost his bearings. And I guess he's pretty wise because he chose to sit down under a tree. He just sat down. He walked so far, he realized best thing to do just sit down. They can come find me. So, and they did. They finally found him. He was out all night and all morning. And, we make it pretty good through singing. But I get in the pulpit, and I began to bear down pretty hard. And I look out and I think, I've got a pretty loud voice. And I can talk pretty loud, it'll wake somebody up. But I couldn't wake those men up. They were conked out. They drifted off pretty fast. And I thought to myself, maybe as a preacher, maybe I ought to let them have a little bit of grace that morning. You know what I mean? I don't speak for God. I don't, I think God understood the heart situation, what was going on. I know He did. But at the time, it sort of bothered me. But looking back on it, and I didn't raise my voice anymore after the first time. I didn't do any good. I just didn't do it anymore. But, you know, generally speaking, we can all make the proper arrangements, relatively speaking, most of the time, to prepare ourselves to come together and worship. And I know people have some ailments and have to take different types of medicine, and I understand medicine puts you to sleep pretty fast. And I'm not harping on that. I'm just telling you, properly speaking, I need to do all I can to stay focused on worship. And maybe as a speaker, if I realize I'm failing in my task of keeping us all on the same page, maybe it'd be wise just to shut it down. But all of us have to battle with ourselves to keep ourselves engaged and follow along. And if we can do that, then we can truly worship. And when we pray, you know, that prayer being led this morning, he already had one this morning, Kenny led it. You know, when he stood up to lead that prayer, he was praying for me. And as he was praying, I was praying along with him. And then sometimes when he pauses, I may have to add a few words. And I think about it at that time, I need to pray for specifically. But he's just leading me through that process. That's what he is, a prayer leader. He's not praying for me. He's not praying for me. I have to be engaged in that as well. When we sing after a while, Ralph can't sing for me. And truly, I understand more than that, probably more than most folks. You know, there are times, and I'm proud it's never happened much, but there are times when I've been unable to sing. Voice, whatever, I just could not do it. But even in that, if that's the case, and I can't sing with my audible mouth and make the sounds out, I still have to sit there and engage myself through that process. And if you ever saw a deaf worship service, you ought to see a deaf worship service as the deaf people, as they sign language their songs to God.
Your mind.
It's got to be through your mind.
Involved.
Yes, and that's your mind, that's your intellect, your conscience, your will. It's all got to be the same power, and the emotions got to come forth as well. And if I can do that, then I can say, hey, I worship in spirit. Now, I'm going to have to make sure, we're going to get to it in just a minute, that's also in truth, but I can make, you know, I don't know what's going to happen this morning. Well, I know what's going to happen this morning because I put something. I have been places where the song leader, I thought, chose an entirely unscriptural song to sing. I couldn't find no redeeming quality in the song whatsoever to sing. Now, what am I going to do? If the song leader, if he turns a blind eye to the truth and he leads a song in our worship service that is entirely unscriptural, that even to the best of my ability, I can't try to twist and contort to put some truth in it where I can sing that, what am I going to do for that period of time in worship? That's why as a song leader, I need to make sure that I'm reading through those songs and I know what they're saying and know what they're teaching.
There are a lot of congregations and places or leaders that have not learned that just a little talk with Jesus is an unscriptural song. It is unscriptural. I'm not going to sing it. I'm not going to sing it. I'm not going to preach that message. I'm not going to sing it either. I just ain't going to do it. And if it's sung, Jim, in a worship service, if I go somewhere, if I'm visiting, they singing that song, then for that little period of time when that song is being sung, I've got to occupy my mind on some other direction. And it's hard to do. For some reason, I was at a meeting in Tennessee, and they led that song just before I got up to preach.
Yeah.
Well, I got up to preach, and the first thing I said well, you people wouldn't let me preach that, why do you sing it? I never got invited back, but.
Well, of course not, yeah. Well, that's what I say. You know, I'm not gonna speak unscriptural truth to my knowledge, nor am I gonna sing one. And I understand as well as anybody that songwriters have poetic license. I understand all of that. I can get over some of that stuff, and I don't try to take a fine tooth comb to every little word, every little phrase. I'm afraid if I go through that songbook, I took my fine tooth comb, I could find a whole lot of things wrong. That song we sung this morning, if I took my little fine tooth comb, I say, look here, brother, that's not right. I'm going to tell you something. When Jesus comes, when he returns one day, we better have something on ourselves besides his righteousness. We better have our own righteousness on as well. But I think I know what I sung this morning. It was this morning, wasn't it, Ralph? Yeah. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found dressed in his righteousness alone. I want to be in his, but I got to have my own too. And so when I sing that song, in my mind, I got to make some adjustments to that, and I can do that. And I'm not afraid to do that. I'm not condemning that song. I'm just saying, you know, if we went to a fine-tooth comb, but my friend, there's some things that are just very blatant. Just very blatant that we can't get over that. And so what I'm saying is it's important, and I was in, several years ago, I was in Nashville, and we had went across the street in the hotel to worship service that morning. Kids were very small. We had our little roll filled up there, my and the kids, and sitting there, and we went through our worship service, the preacher got to preach, and I sat there, and I thought, I just can't. I told Myra, I said, let's just go. Let's just go. I thought, I'm not going to sit here and listen to this falseness. They had a scriptural song service, took the Lord's Supper, everything was in order, and he began to preach all kind of untruths like the Holy Spirit. Best thing to do is what? We just got up and left. And by the time we got up and left, he'd done shut everything down, and had the invitation song as we was sort of packing up, trying to get our way out, and he chased me down. Chased me down. I thought, that's very fortunate you chased me down. I want to talk to you anyway. I told him what I was doing, why I was leaving. He didn't care, but anyway, what I'm saying is, you go into a place and you can understand when you get there, you don't know if it's going to be truth or not. Especially if it isn't going to roll somewhere. But we can always make sure that what we do is in our spirit. Let me move on. Got to be in truth. Spirit, also in truth. Is that the second bell? We'll just mark the truth and get there next Sunday morning then. Thank you for your attention.